None of them asked Merrick Garland over the last 4 years one word about Jeffrey Epstein. How ironic is that? You know why? Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now.
It is a war. That is not a metaphor. That is not a dramatic exaggeration for television. Those words, or something very close to them in spirit, have been used to describe what is happening right now inside the most powerful legal institution in the United States of America, the Department of Justice. And if you think the story here is simply that Donald Trump fired his attorney general, you are only looking at the surface. Because what has unfolded in the weeks surrounding the removal of Pam Bondi is something far more consequential than a personnel change. It is the story of how the inner circle of the most powerful political machine in modern American history began to fracture from within. It is the story of classified documents accidentally handed to Congress by the very people trying to protect the president. It is the story of a legal team so consumed by its own internal battles that it ended up doing the opposition's work for them. And it is a story that is still developing in ways that should concern every person watching, because when the machinery of federal law enforcement starts to eat itself, the consequences reach far beyond Washington. Let us start from the beginning, because this story has layers, and each layer matters. Pam Bondi was not supposed to be the Attorney General of the United States. She was the second choice. Trump's first pick was former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, whose nomination collapsed under the weight of congressional scrutiny and allegations of personal misconduct, so serious that even members of Trump's own party refused to support him. Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, was brought in as a replacement, a loyal ally with a long history of standing by Trump. She had famously defended him during his first impeachment trial in 2020. She was by every measure a trusted insider. She was confirmed by the Senate in a 54-46 vote in February of 2025, and she was sworn in the very next day. And from that first day in office, she made it unmistakably clear that she intended to run the Department of Justice as an extension of the White House, not as an independent institution. She came into office and immediately did away with the long-standing Department of Justice practice of maintaining political independence from the White House. On her first day, she shut down several Department of Justice task forces and aligned closely with White House priorities. The FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force was shut down. Career officials in the Civil Rights Division were pushed out in significant numbers. The Public Integrity Section, a post-Watergate unit created specifically to prevent the politicization of corruption prosecutions, was stripped of authority and reduced dramatically in size. In a remarkably short tenure as Attorney General, Pam Bondi helped drag one of the country's most respected institutions deeper into grievance, spectacle, and political retaliation. Democracy Now! MS Now! But the issue that would ultimately define her tenure and end it was the Jeffrey Epstein files. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, there was enormous anticipation among his base that his administration would finally expose the truth about Jeffrey Epstein, the notorious sex offender who had died in federal custody in 2019 and who had been connected to some of the most powerful men in the world. Trump had made noises during his 2024 campaign about releasing the files. His supporters had been promised something explosive. Bondi moved quickly to position herself as the champion of that transparency. Attorney General Bondi requested the full and complete files related to Jeffrey Epstein. In response, the department received approximately 200 pages of documents, and she was later informed of thousands of pages of documents related to the investigation and indictment of Epstein that were not previously disclosed. Rather than methodically handling this material with the care it deserved, Bondi staged a photo opportunity. In February, she distributed Epstein files binders to conservative influencers at the White House, except the binders contained almost no new information. Some of the influencers balked at what amounted to a pretty substance-free photo opportunity. The rollout was a disaster, and then Bondi made it worse by making a series of statements that would haunt her for months. U.S. Department of Justice CNN Bondi said in a February 2025 interview on Fox News that an Epstein client list was sitting on her desk to review, only for the department to later assert no such list existed. When pressed, she attempted to clarify that she had been referring to all the Epstein-related paperwork broadly, but the damage was done. And then came the July 2025 announcement that shattered whatever trust remained. The Department of Justice released a statement saying the systematic review revealed no incriminating client list and that no further disclosure would be appropriate or warranted. The conservative media erupted. Influencers who had stood by the administration demanded accountability. Commentators who had enthusiastically promoted the release called the outcome unforgivable. CNN PBS. While all of this was playing out publicly, Trump was also privately growing frustrated with Bondi on a completely separate front. He had expected her to use the Department of Justice to pursue criminal investigations and prosecutions of his political enemies. In September 2025, in what became one of the most embarrassing moments of the entire episode, Trump intended his Truth Social post imploring Attorney General Pam Bondi to take legal action against his opponents as a direct message. Trump was surprised to learn he had actually posted the message to his Truth Social account. The post addressed Bondi by name, expressing frustration that nothing was being done, and specifically mentioning former FBI Director James Comey, Senator Adam Schiff, and New York Attorney General Letitia James. It was an accidental public revelation of exactly the kind of pressure Trump had been applying behind closed doors, and it directly contradicted his repeated public claims that he had never interfered with Justice Department charging decisions. NBC News' Bondi did eventually move against Trump's adversaries. Just days after Trump's post, Trump forced out a United States attorney who resisted, and Comey was indicted. About 2 weeks after that, James was indicted. But both indictments were based on what observers described as flimsy evidence, and the replacement United States attorney was found to have been illegally appointed. The prosecutions were not just politically controversial, they were legally weak, and that weakness came back to embarrass the administration. On November 24th, Bondi and the Department of Justice were embarrassed by the dismissal of federal criminal prosecutions of former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James. Trump had pushed for these prosecutions personally. The Justice Department had delivered them and then watched them collapse under judicial review. CNN, CNBC. This is the context you need to hold in your mind as we move forward. By early 2026, it was becoming clear that Bondi was losing on all fronts simultaneously. The Epstein situation continued to deteriorate. By March 2026, the House Oversight Committee had subpoenaed her, accusing her of completely whiffing on the investigation and refusing to comply with congressional demands. Despite her long-standing loyalty to President Donald Trump, Bondi's handling of the files became a political liability. Republicans who once defended her began distancing themselves, and reports surfaced that Trump had grown frustrated with the ongoing fallout. Newsweek, and then came the Congressional hearing in February 2026, where things went from bad to catastrophic. While testifying before Congress in February, Bondi refused to apologize directly to Epstein's victims for the department's mishandling of their information. In one of the most sensitive document productions imaginable, her Department of Justice managed to fail in the most shameful direction, not by finally exposing the powerful, but by once again endangering the vulnerable. The department had exposed the names and in some cases the photographs of Epstein's victims in the course of its releases, exactly the people the careful management of these files was supposed to protect. MS now, but here is where the story takes a turn that most of the coverage has failed to fully appreciate. Because even as Bondi was managing the fallout from the Epstein debacle, her own department was simultaneously committing a blunder of a completely different kind, one that would strike at the very heart of Trump's legal exposure on matters he considers existential. In March of 2026, the Department of Justice sent a batch of documents to the House Judiciary Committee. The documents were intended to be part of the Republican-led majority's effort to undermine the credibility of former special counsel Jack Smith and his investigations into Trump. The idea was to discredit Smith by releasing material that raised questions about how his investigations were conducted. It was a strategic offensive move, except the people who assembled that document. Production made a catastrophic error. In a sharply worded letter to Attorney General Pam Bondi, the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Jamie Raskin, claimed newly disclosed documents revealed that Donald Trump retained highly sensitive classified materials tied directly to his personal business interests and may have even shown them off in private settings. The documents, sent on March 13th by Bondi's own Justice Department, included a January 2023 memorandum from the special counsel's office that alleged that some of the classified documents Trump retained would be pertinent to certain business interests. Raskin's letter to Bondi was blistering. He wrote that the department, apparently blinded by the frenzied search to find any scrap of evidence that could be twisted against Jack Smith, had quite amazingly missed the fact that some of the documents provided included damning evidence about their own boss's conduct. The Daily Boulder Axios think about what actually happened here. The Department of Justice, run by Trump's hand-picked Attorney General, assembling documents specifically designed to protect and vindicate Trump, managed to accidentally hand Congress material that the opposition immediately characterized as some of the most damaging evidence yet against the president. Raskin wrote that these new disclosures suggest that Donald Trump retained documents so sensitive that only 6 people in the entire United States government had access to them, and that the materials appear to involve Trump's financial interests and were handled in ways that raised serious national security concerns. This was not a leak orchestrated by a disgruntled official. This was self-inflicted. This was the legal team for the most litigated president in American history, accidentally doing the opposition's work for them while trying to do the opposite. The Daily Boulder, There is another dimension to this document disaster that deserves attention. The document production not only seemingly contained grand jury material, but appeared to obliterate the government's own argument before Judge Cannon that a careful review was no longer feasible given the departures of Special Counsel Smith and his team from the Department of Justice. In other words, by releasing these documents to Congress, Bondi's department may have also violated the protective order issued by Judge Eileen Cannon, the same Trump-appointed judge who had already thrown out the classified documents case entirely. The department was potentially in violation of a court order issued by a judge favorable to the president it was trying to protect. The White House response was telling. A spokesperson simply dismissed Raskin as someone lacking credibility and moved on. House now consider why Bondi's relationship with Trump was already so severely strained by the time this document disaster landed. Trump had privately mused about firing his Attorney General and replacing her with Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lee Zeldin. Frustrated by the backlash and anger in his base over the administration's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files, Trump had asked people about replacing Bondi. The idea had first surfaced as early as January 2025, just days after her confirmation, and it had never fully gone away. It resurfaced with significant force in the spring of 2026, CNN. The pressure was not coming only from the president either. Inside the Department of Justice itself, there was growing awareness that the Epstein situation had become politically terminal. Reports emerged that Dan Bongino, the deputy director of the FBI, had a heated confrontation with Bondi over her handling of the files and was considering resigning. Bongino was later demoted to co-deputy director and subsequently announced his upcoming resignation in December of 2025. This is significant. Bongino was a Trump loyalist of the highest order, a former Secret Service agent, a conservative media personality whose alignment with the MAGA movement was never in question. And even he was so disturbed by how the Epstein files situation was being handled that he had a confrontational meeting with the Attorney General and was ultimately pushed out. When you lose the confidence of someone like Bongino, you have lost something important. Wikipedia. On April 2nd, 2026, Trump made it official. Trump fired Attorney General Pam Bondi. Bondi's dismissal came after reports that Trump was increasingly unhappy about her handling of Department of Justice files about the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and the Department of Justice's failure to successfully prosecute several of the president's political enemies. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche would serve as acting Attorney General. Blanche, notably, is Trump's former personal defense lawyer, the man who defended Trump at his criminal trial in New York. He is now the acting head of the Department of Justice. That transition itself tells you everything about what Trump is looking for in that role. Not an institutionalist, not even a loyal political ally in the Bondi mold, but someone whose personal loyalty to Trump precedes and supersedes any other consideration. CNBC Bondi wound up serving the shortest tenure for a confirmed Attorney General in 60 years. She had come in with real political capital, genuine loyalty credentials, and a clear mandate. She left having failed on the most politically important task Trump had given her, while also presiding over the accidental disclosure of potentially damaging legal material to the president's congressional opponents. And while failing to successfully prosecute the enemies Trump had publicly and privately demanded be brought to justice. CNN. Here is the analysis the headlines are not fully capturing, and this is the part of this story that matters most. What the Pam Bondi episode reveals is not simply that one attorney general failed. What it reveals is a structural crisis in the way Trump has attempted to run the Department of Justice in his second term. The problem is not that Bondi was uniquely incompetent. The problem is that the task she was given was contradictory and ultimately impossible. You cannot simultaneously weaponize the Department of Justice for political purposes and expect it to function with the procedural competence that sensitive legal work requires. You cannot purge career officials, hollow out institutional expertise, redirect departmental priorities toward political score settling, and then expect the remaining infrastructure to handle something as legally complex as the Epstein files with precision. Georgetown University law professor David Cole, former National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, put it directly. She came in and did the master's bidding, and she did it poorly. That is the real indictment here, not of Bondi personally, but of the entire framework within which she was operating. When an institution is restructured around loyalty rather than competence, when career professionals are replaced with political operators, when the mission of the institution is redefined from the administration of justice to the advancement of a political agenda, the institution loses the internal checks that prevent exactly this kind of self-inflicted disaster. The accidental handing of damaging documents to Congress was not a random act of incompetence. It was the predictable consequence of a department stripped of the institutional memory, the procedural discipline, and the independent judgment that would have caught that error before it happened. Democracy now. There is also a geopolitical dimension to this story. Right now, the United States is engaged in a confrontation with Iran that has drawn extraordinary international attention. There are ongoing trade tensions that are reshaping global economic relationships, and the world is watching an American president who just fired his Attorney General, his second major cabinet departure in recent weeks, following the firing of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Bondi was the second high-profile cabinet member to be fired by Trump in recent weeks, after former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem was ousted in March. That pattern of rapid cabinet turnover sends a message to every foreign government observing this administration. It signals that the inner circle is not stable. It signals that the criteria for survival within that circle have less to do with competence and more to do with the degree to which one satisfies the personal demands of the president. Foreign governments, whether allies calculating how much to trust American commitments or adversaries calculating how much to push, factor that instability into their decision-making. CNBC Bondi herself is not gone from the picture. Representative Robert Garcia, a California Democrat who is the Oversight Panel's ranking member, wrote that Pam Bondi and Donald Trump may think her firing gets her out of testifying to the Oversight Committee. He said they are wrong, and the committee looks forward to hearing from her under oath. The Republican majority on the House Oversight Committee canceled her scheduled April 14th deposition, citing the fact that she was no longer Attorney General. Democrats are contesting that cancellation vigorously, and separately, the Department of Justice's internal watchdog has said that it is investigating the department's compliance with a law requiring that it fully disclose department files about Jeffrey Epstein. That investigation will not simply disappear because Bondi has been removed. CNBC. In the short term, the installation of Todd Blanche as acting Attorney General almost certainly means a more aggressive posture on the things Trump cares most about. Blanche knows Trump personally, has defended him legally at the highest stakes, and has every incentive to run the department in a way that satisfies rather than frustrates the president. But there is a risk in that arrangement. The more the Department of Justice is perceived by the courts, by the legal profession, by the public, as an extension of Trump's personal legal defense team rather than an independent institution, the more that perception undermines the legal credibility of everything the department does. Prosecutions brought by a department perceived as politically motivated become harder to sustain in federal court. Judges are already watching this administration's legal conduct with extraordinary scrutiny, and there is a deep irony embedded in this entire saga. Bondi was brought in to be the loyal soldier who would do what Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr had ultimately refused to do fully. She was supposed to bend the institutional weight of the Department of Justice entirely to the president's will. And she did try. She tried harder than any of her predecessors in the Trump era. She shut down the independent structures on day one. She initiated the prosecutions Trump demanded. She managed the Epstein release under impossible political pressure, and it was not because the demands being placed on the institution exceed what any individual can deliver without the institutional support that had already been dismantled. She was asked to be a wrecking ball and a precision instrument simultaneously, and the result is what you see: a shattered record, a fired cabinet member, accidentally disclosed documents, and a department whose credibility is at a historic low. So the question this situation leaves on the table is the one that matters most. Is what we are witnessing a minor rift in the inner circle, a personnel disagreement that will be smoothed over once the right person is installed? Or is this the beginning of something more significant? The early signs that the internal architecture of this administration is not as solid as its supporters believe, and that the pressures being placed on the people and institutions around Trump are starting to produce fractures that will only widen with time. The documents that were accidentally handed to Congress, those specific classified materials connecting retained documents to business interests, may yet prove to be one of the most consequential administrative errors in recent political memory. The real leaker in the end may not be a disgruntled official. It may simply be the chaos. Drop your answer in the comments below. Tell me who you think bears the most responsibility for this unraveling, and whether you believe the people now running the Department of Justice can actually hold it together. If this video gave you a perspective you had not considered before, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the next chapter of this story is already developing, and we will be here to break it down when it does.